Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Monday, July 1st, 2019, here on the campus of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. With me today for the Center on the American Governor is Kevin Ryan, who served as New Jersey's first child advocate from 2003 to 2006, and later as the first commissioner of the Department of Children and Families in the administration of New Jersey's 45th governor, John Corzine. Kevin, welcome to Eagleton.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about your background.
Sure.
Where did you grow up?
I was born at Fort Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and my dad headed off to Vietnam a couple of days after I was born. And my mom moved to my dad's childhood home in South Amboy in Middlesex County, and I spent all my childhood there.
And you were not an itinerant military child?
No, when my dad finished serving in Vietnam, he came home, and he was a teacher, and he raised my 5 brothers and me with my mom in South Amboy.
Wow. Now, I understand you went to Catholic University as
did.
undergraduate.
Yeah.
And the Covenant House website lists you as having attended both Georgetown Law School and NYU Law School.
That's right.
Did you go from one to the other, or how did that work?
I got my JD from Georgetown, and right after Georgetown, I had a Skadden Fellowship. So the law firm Skadden Arps provides fellowships for folks who are graduating from law school and judicial clerks to do a couple of years of public interest work. And my fellowship was at Covenant House. So I did that, and while I was at Covenant House, I started working on an LLM, a master's in law, and I did that at NYU.
That's an unusual situation, isn't it? An LLM, I mean, everybody knows about a JD, but
Yeah.
Explain what an LLM is. How does that work?
Well, typically it's an extra year or two of law school. For me, it was 4 years because I did it part-time. And I was studying constitutional law, public interest law, the kinds of things that I was interested in at the time. And I was really interested in also learning more about the work that would be really meaningful at Covenant House to kids, so poverty law, immigration law. And I met at NYU 2 of the teachers of my life, a guy named Marty Guggenheim, who's still there now, and Peggy Cooper Davis, who's still there now, who helped me see the world in a very different way.
How?
Well, Marty is an advocate for parents. And I was working at a place, Covenant House, where most kids didn't have parents, or their parents were drug-addled, or were disinterested. And that time at Covenant House had filled me with a sense that what was wrong with kids was largely driven by their families. And Marty reminded me that everything that's right about kids is because of families, and that the key to success is strengthening families, not attacking parents. It took me a hot minute to understand that what I was seeing at Covenant House was an aberration from what was going on in the world, and that it was really important to be reflective about the key forward for kids would be community, mentors, and whenever possible, reconnecting them with families. And Peggy wrote a book called Neglected Stories, in which she worked through the antebellum South and trying to think about the Reconstruction documents and the ratification of the 14th Amendment. What was it that led lawmakers to decide that there should be equal protection? And what she discovered, sort of flipping originalism on its head, is that it really was about family dignity and privacy. It was about trying to return to slaves this sense of family integrity, connection to the one that they loved, their brothers and their sisters, their children. And she makes this very powerful argument that the Constitution does, in fact, have a large sphere of protection for family dignity, family privacy, family integrity, substantive due process, if you will. And I loved that. I loved the sense that the Constitution was a dynamic document that nonetheless had a deep and powerful declaration, took a hot minute, after the Civil War, on the power of family in the United States of America.
Did you know, even as an undergraduate, that this was the kind of direction that you would take professionally, or did this come about largely because of your graduate work?
That's a great question. I mean, I think my hardwiring was there at the start. My folks were civic-minded, and my dad was very involved in the local first aid. In fact, he just celebrated 62 years of volunteer service to the South Amboy First Aid Squad, interrupted only by his service in Vietnam. So we were raised by folks who were involved in the Board of Education, involved in the local first aid squad. And I was interested in finding a space and a place to give back in the public square. But this work with kids, that kind of grew on me over time. I saw when my now wife, but then girlfriend Claire was volunteering for a year at Covenant House in New Orleans right after college, the way in which the kids inhabited her heart, and it riveted me, I wanted that.
Is that how you first learned of Covenant House?
Well, I'd heard about Covenant House. My folks had been donors, and the founder of Covenant House had come to college and had talked a little bit about Covenant House. I'd only gone because Claire was going. And I went down to New Orleans, a little bugged, frankly, that she was going to this place far away from me to do this work. If anything, Covenant House, in my first awareness of it, or at least my first adult awareness of it, was kind of an annoyance. It's like, well, why is my girlfriend hanging out down here? But I saw the work unfolding in beautiful and powerful ways, and I wanted to be a part of that.
And so when you had finished undergraduate work, had gotten your law degree at Georgetown, you then went on a fellowship to work at Covenant House in New York?
In New York, and I was doing general civil legal aid work with kids. Immigration work, housing, family, really whatever came in the front door. There were young people who didn't know their families. There were young people who'd aged out of foster care. There were young people who had been brought to the United States by either adoptive parents or by some birth family members, and their parents had status, but they didn't have status. So we're trying to get those young people status in the country. It was.
It's interesting. It's sort of the opposite of the DACA kids, right?
It is. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Explain to our viewers or readers, those who are reading a transcript, what is Covenant House?
Yeah.
How does it function? What's its mission?
Well, Covenant House is a charity that works in North and Central America across 31 cities and 6 countries to open doors for young people who are homeless. That includes children, youth between the ages of 18 and 22, young families, parents with infants and toddlers, but parents themselves who are teenagers. And the idea is to help young people get off the streets, to find safety, and to walk across that bridge from poverty to opportunity and hope. It involves, obviously, housing and shelter. There are almost 90,000 young people we reach every year, but it also involves medical clinics and legal services programs and job training programs and mental health programs. The idea really is to help kids who aren't surrounded by an inspiring circle of love to find their place in the world and be helium for their dreams. Help kids to soar. Just the same thing that my folks did for me. That's what we're trying to do for young people.
How many employees does it have? How many volunteers does it have?
Well, we have 2,000 employees from Managua, Nicaragua to Anchorage, Alaska, and Hollywood to Newark and Elizabeth and Atlantic City here in New Jersey. But we have over 10,000 volunteers, doctors, lawyers, mentors, financial analysts. In fact, one of my favorite stories is John Corzine, before he got involved in Covenant House as a board member, was working with some of the kids and was doing a tax prep session with them. And I was talking to one of the kids and I said, do you realize that John was former governor of New Jersey? And the kid looked at John and he looked back at me and he said, am I getting a refund? So they're really not that interested in titles. They're interested in meeting people who can help them move forward in life.
Did you know John Corzine before you joined his administration?
I did not know him. I'd met him briefly when I was testifying as the state child advocate before Congress in connection with reform of national child welfare systems.
When he was in the U.S. Senate.
Exactly. And we met in his office for half hour perhaps, but we didn't know each other outside of that meeting, and I never saw him again until I started to have a conversation with him about joining the administration.
Mm-hmm. Now let's go back before we get there.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about what you did at Covenant House, because you were there for about 10 years or so before you started in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And I believe it's according to their website, you started a legal aid program for homeless families in the city that expanded over those 10 years to the Bronx and Brooklyn and Atlantic City and Newark. and you've described what that program is all about. How did you systematically begin to expand it? Was that the idea?
I mean, that was part of it. There were foundations, the Bar Association here in New Jersey were interested in helping to create more opportunities for legal services. So we tapped into that and we expanded as the resources became available. I also, during that time, became interested in things other than the law. I came to Covenant House with all the arrogance and none of the skill that you get in graduate school, and I rolled in there realizing that I really didn't have what it takes to help a young person cross that bridge sustainably from poverty to opportunity. I had a piece of it, but I was a small piece of it. Sometimes there were problems that required the expertise of doctors or social workers or mentors or job counselors. I became interested in all that. And my time in New Jersey was really about trying to build programs that would help young people change their lives and turn things around, and not so much just about the law. I was about as poor as you could be. So we had, let's see, we might have at this time had 3 of our 6 children, maybe 4. I was making $32,000 a year. I had
that was decent money back in those days.
That's not decent money. I had $180,000 in debt. Okay. The 2 of us did from school. So I was teaching at night. I was teaching law school in order to pay the bills. I can still remember John Feerick, the dean of Fordham Law School, saying to me at the time, "Thank you so much for teaching. I know no one does it for the pay." And I was like, "Why do they do it? Why do they do it? What do you mean they don't do it for the pay? This is the electric bill for 6 months." Right. So it was a very full time where I was sort of scratching the law itch, if you will, by teaching at night. Interestingly, at Seton Hall Law School and at Fordham Law School, I met in those years colleagues who are with me today running some of Covenant House's biggest programs. Really? They were my students at the time, though they are teachers to me now.
Little did you know that you were going to be a recruiter.
No, exactly. Yeah. Come with me.
One of the things that got you much more involved in New Jersey was co-writing the New Jersey Homeless Youth Act that was signed into law by Governor Whitman in 1999.
Yeah.
What led to the passage of that act, and what was in that act?
Yeah. It was a crazy situation in New Jersey where kids or young adults, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, they could not access certain services without permission from a parent or a guardian. Certainly, if you were 16 and 17, you could not. And then in certain categories, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds couldn't either. And that didn't make any sense. For children who'd been kicked out of their homes, they needed permission from those parents in order to walk into a place like Covenant House or the Somerset Home for Temporarily Displaced Children, or any of the patchwork of programs that exist in the state for homeless young people. And the law changed that. The law gave young people permission in an emergency to come for 3 days, and then the agency, like Covenant House, would contact the state and say, "Look, we have a young person here, and they can't go home, or there isn't a home." So it just gave kids the ability to come into safety and to exhale and make sure that nobody was going to have a problem with the police or other authorities as a result of the kids being with us. And then because of the advocacy of Joe Vitale, who was a new senator at the time, it might have been his first or second year as a state senator, and he co-sponsored the bill with Bill Gormley, who was a legendary Atlantic County senator. The two of them created an appropriation that funded a number of programs across the state and grew opportunities for kids to come out of the darkness and into safety. And I was really grateful for the two of them, because at the time, there weren't a lot of people who were saying, "Oh, we need to grow more services for young people who are overcoming homelessness in the state." But the two of them believed deeply that we could do more. And as a result, thousands and thousands of kids have found safety in the state.
Now, how was it that you and a colleague ended up actually physically writing the legislation?
Well, we met up with Jennifer Velez, who was an assistant counsel at the time to Governor Whitman, went on later to become one of my dearest friends, and she succeeded me as the Commissioner of Human Services many years later. And Jennifer in the governor's office and Senator Vitale and Senator Gormley took our draft and began to win support for it across the legislature.
And you drafted this because you saw this as a failing of New Jersey's system?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And we just saw many examples of kids who were being turned away from shelter because providers didn't have the ability to welcome them in the front door. I have to say, Covenant House largely respected the law in the breach, so we were letting kids come in regardless. But there were lots of programs that weren't doing that. And at the time, Covenant House was only in Newark and Atlantic City. I mean, now Covenant House is in 9 cities, but at the time it was only in those 2. So most of the rest of the state was other programs that either were or weren't letting kids come in.
Now, is Covenant House in a place like Newark or Atlantic City?
Yeah.
It is a physical space that Covenant House owns.
Yes.
And takes in youth who are displaced or are homeless.
Yeah, New Jersey, it's in Asbury Park and Camden and Jersey City and Montclair. There are specialized programs in New Jersey. So one of the programs is for kids who are living with mental illness. Another program is for young survivors of human trafficking. In Elizabeth, it's a program for teen moms and their babies. And then the big front doors, if you will, where it's just come in and we'll assess what's going on and try to get you into safe housing. They're in Atlantic City and in Newark. We're actually building a program right now in Asbury Park. So we have a boys program, we're opening a girls program. It's really a beautiful thing in some ways. In other ways, it's discouraging.
Well, it's sad if you have an ever-growing population.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Who administered the program at that point? The Division of Youth and Family Services?
Who administered Covenant House?
Well, no. Who administered this act that was passed in 1999? I mean, who ensured that the not only Covenant House but Somerset County or wherever there were other programs similar were actually doing the job that the act commanded them to do?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, the money came through the Department of Human Services, so the funding was granted by DHS. In terms of oversight of the programs, back then they weren't all licensed. Now it would be DHS or DCF, actually, be Department of Children and Families. But in its first iteration, I guess it was DHS.
Now, the Division of Youth and Family Services, the old DYFS, that was everybody's favorite whipping boy, had a lot of problems for many, many years. Yeah. And those seemed to culminate right around the end of the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s, in some very serious accusations about malfeasance and things that were happening. Explain what exactly was going on at that time and what prompted your appointment as the child advocate.
I mean, New Jersey had, at the time, a statewide system that was in disrepair and was dramatically underfunded. So you'd have a caseworker who was charged with investigating whether or not a little one was abused or neglected, typically at all hours of the day and night. And their caseloads would sometimes be 60, 70, 80 children.
And these were state employees, social workers?
Yeah, state employees. I used to say to folks, imagine as a parent if you went into a classroom and you saw that your child, little Kevin, was one of 80 desks in that room. And your child isn't at risk of abuse and neglect, but they're certainly not thriving if the teacher is dividing her time between 70, 80 kids. And so the imperative was startling, but that isn't really what mobilized public attention and political will. It was a set of very bad child fatalities. One involving a young boy named Fahim, whose mummified corpse was found in a basement in Newark after DYFS had been called repeatedly to look into what was happening with this child. And DYFS, either did a poor job or didn't go out at all. I actually think it was a mix of responses. And when police discovered that this boy, in fact, had been kept mummified in the basement for a long time, and the state knew about the child's risk and didn't do anything about it, or didn't do enough about it and didn't save his life, it stirred people and moved people in a different way. Now, at the time, and the media plays an incredibly important role in mobilizing political will, at the time, there were 7 reporters on this. There were 2 New York Times reporters, Rich Lezen-Jones and Tina Kelly. I met Tina. I mean, Tina and I went on to write a book like a decade and a half later, but I met her there. She was a beat reporter for the Times. Sue Livio, really, I think the only reporter still on this case. Mitch Lipka for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Gannett had reporters on it. And then all of a sudden CNN showed up and MSNBC showed up. And for Governor McGreevey and Jamie Foxx, who was his chief of staff at the time, the horror of this and the public outcry around it required a very different response than the typical, okay, we'll appoint a blue ribbon commission and the regular characters will come out and issue a set of findings that will be layered on top of the previous blue ribbon commission's set of findings, because it wasn't changing things for kids. And in fact, Fahim's death was not, well, I think the horror and the reaction of it was atypical. The kind of public response, the agency's investigative response, that wasn't atypical at the time. Workers were just completely overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. So what was the solution?
Well, at the same time, an advocacy group in New York City sued the state, Children's Rights, a spinoff from the ACLU. It was one of those federal kitchen sink lawsuits that alleged that everything was wrong. And there was...
In this case, that was probably pretty accurate.
I think it was accurate. And there was a real desire to use that as a vehicle to fix the system.
So DYFS was under, well, not under indictment, but they were being sued. So
they were being sued. They were sued in the last several years of Governor Whitman's administration. The story that I've just told you about, Fahim, that happened in the McGreevey administration, and that catalyzed a real interest in settling the lawsuit. It hadn't settled before Fahim died. And so there was a settlement, and the settlement was a bit of a mess. In the early going, it was a lot of promises without a real theory of change.
Was any of it monetary?
It certainly required public investment, but there wasn't.
Okay.
Yeah, there wasn't at the time that I recall. There wasn't anything monetary. I mean, it required lots of new money into the system. Caseloads had to be reduced, et cetera. But it really wasn't until John Corzine was elected that, and by the way, when he was elected, there was a contempt motion pending in the lawsuit because of the failure of reform and a receivership motion pending. So the plaintiff's counsel had gone to federal court and had said, not only has this gone badly, it's gone so badly, we want to take over the system. And it was in that context that John Corzine was walking in the front door. It was a system that at that time had been on the front page of the Washington Post, the New York Times. There were plenty of stories about how bad the system was. Plaintiffs' counsel were fed up with the state's promises and failure to deliver on change. Kids continued to be hurt. Caseloads were ludicrously high. And most of the key stakeholders in New Jersey were deeply skeptical that change was possible. And Corzine was elected.
Well, let's talk about that period from McGreevey to Corzine, because in 2003 you were appointed as this new child advocate, which had to have been part of that settlement, or certainly you were tasked with finding out what was wrong and what was going on and trying to fix it.
Yeah, in addition to the settlement, it was the creation of the Office of the Child Advocate was something that Governor McGreevey and lawmakers had undertaken because they wanted more accountability and more transparency. And it was an effort on their part to ensure that whatever was missed by the lawsuit wouldn't get missed by the Office of the Child Advocate. And the mandate for the Office of the Child Advocate was broad. It included not just the child welfare system, but all the public systems that served kids at risk of abuse and neglect. So the developmental centers that worked and served children who had developmental disabilities, the juvenile justice system in the state, which is really where we spent a lot of time in the early going as child advocate.
Mm-hmm. When you were appointed by McGreevey, to this position, and to whom did the child advocate, was that part of the Department of the Public Advocate, or was it part of the Department of the Division of Youth and Family Services, or Human Service? How did it function?
There was no public advocate yet.
That didn't come back.
It was an in but not of the Department of Law and Public Safety. And the child advocate didn't serve coterminously with the AG or with the governor. and wasn't to be supervised by them.
So it was functionally independent.
Yeah, I mean, I set up a board of advisors, included the former public advocate Stanley Van Ness, among others, but there was no commissioner or cabinet member the child advocate reported to, which I think in hindsight was a strength and was a weakness, because the strength obviously was that it allowed the office to be very independent, and the weakness was that there wasn't an effective way to play the inside game on budget appropriations, on some of the key decision making that would have, I think, improved some of these systems.
Well, you also had a governor then who resigned midterm,
Yeah.
and an acting governor in Dick Cody who
Right.
continued up until the election
Right.
of 2005. So did that create dysfunction in terms of your ability to get anything done?
I don't think it created dysfunction. I never talked with Jim McGreevey after the day that I left his office and became child advocate. We never had a single conversation. I think within no time at all, I was working very hard to demonstrate the office's independence, and he had a lot of other obligations. And we never found any natural moments to coalesce. And I didn't know Senator Cody very well, so I didn't have any interactions with him either. And I worked largely through the press and through advocacy organizations in the state.
In an attempt to reform DYFS? Is that basically what
most,
you're talking about?
At first it was the juvenile justice system.
Oh, okay.
I can remember going into the Camden County Juvenile Detention Center. Now at the time, many of these detention centers were very overcrowded. There were 137 kids in a detention center that was licensed for 31. There were 14 kids in a 13 by 15 cell, some of them truant, some of them accused of sexual assaults mixed in together. And I was determined with the team I was working with at the time to bring transparency to that, because it was some of the most shocking stuff I'd ever seen, and I couldn't believe it was happening in New Jersey. And it wasn't just Camden, though Camden was the worst. It was also happening in Union County. Kids were killing themselves as a result of the despair that jugulated them. The Essex County Detention Center was overcrowded. I brought an NPR reporter, Nancy Solomon, in with me, and she was as shocked as I was. One of the stories I will never forget is I brought the DYFS director in with me to see the Camden County Detention Center. So the juvenile justice system reports up in the state, or did at the time,
Corrections.
to the
Right.
no, to the Attorney General.
Oh.
And the DYFS director, a guy named Ed Cotton, he reported up to the Human Services Commissioner. So I said, Ed, come in here, come with me. Some of these are your kids. So he comes in, sees the second cell, sees the kids packed in there. He says to me, "You should sue these people." I said, "Ed, you're these people, Ed." I said, "Get these kids out of here." And at the time, very fortunately, there was a brilliant young innovator, Lisa Macaluso, who was the number 2 or 3 person at the Juvenile Justice Commission, and she was incubating a real metabolism among the judges in Camden County and among the police officials in Camden County and the prosecutor's office to do something very different. And so while I was antagonizing and bringing a lot of public attention to this problem, she was working very effectively internally to get people to do something constructive about it. Now, we're the best of friends now. At the time, we could barely speak to each other because we had very different roles. And the kind of success you see in New Jersey today with, dramatic reforms in the care of young people and many alternatives to detention that are much more effective in preventing long-term chronic, recidivism, would never have been possible, in my view, without Lisa's inside game, and the public attention that the media and the press brought to conditions for kids inside these detention centers.
Now, I'm a little confused. In the interest of transparency, I'll point out that for the first year of Jim Florio's administration, I worked in the Office of Policy and Planning, and primarily on corrections issues. Mm-hmm. And one of the areas that we spent a lot of time focusing on was juvenile justice. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a corrections area of interest.
It might have been at the time, but
it's possible that over a period of time, that
moved to law and public
thing
safety.
moved to law and public safety.
When I was serving as the child advocate, it was part of law and public safety.
I see.
Yeah.
All right, so you're in this position where you're sort of in the government, but your primary interest and responsibility is to sort of change what's happening by the way the government functions.
Yeah.
And the state is under a consent decree at this point to change the way in which it's delivering these services.
Yes.
It took Governor Corzine and his election to focus attention on this to the extent that was necessary, would you say?
Well, John in particular, it's hard for me to describe the thinking of Governor McGreevey or Governor Cody because I wasn't a confidant of theirs. And knowing them now the way I do know them, I know that their hearts had to be as troubled as Governor Corzine's was about what was happening. But Governor Corzine's the one that I was having the conversations with. So I know what he was thinking at the time, and he was deeply troubled by what was going on. And the politics of it were not unimportant, but it wasn't what he led with. You know, he really, the thing about John that I came to love, and not the thing that I saw a lot of, frankly, in Trenton, is that John was the same guy in front of the cameras as he was behind the cameras. In fact, he was actually a little more articulate off camera than he was on camera.
Well, we've known other governors who have done the same way.
He was just very straight about it, and he is in pain that the system was so broken and kids were being treated so badly. And I know that he saw it as a tall order, but an imperative to fix that system.
When did he first approach you? Well, did he first approach you about creating the Department of Children and Families, or did he think about creating the Department of Children and Families and then approach you?
Well, it went like this. I was serving as a child advocate, and upon reflection, I was very dissatisfied.
I actually should, wait a minute, I should interrupt you, excuse me, but we should go back to how did you come to be the child advocate? You were working in Covenant House. You were there for 10 years.
Yeah.
You had co-written this piece of legislation. But how did McGreevey call you up and ask you? Were you recruited to do this job? Were you interested in doing the job? Did you volunteer? How did this come about?
So I joined Governor McGreevey's administration and went to the Department of Human Services right at the get-go. I left Covenant House after 10 years, and I was really interested in seeing if many of the problems that were recurring in the lives of young people at Covenant House might be addressed with bigger solutions, public policy solutions. And I really wanted to go at public service and trying to make this better for kids.
And this was before the child advocate position had been created. I see. Okay.
Yeah. And so we ended up, he appointed me as the chief of staff at the Department of Human Services. I did that for a year. Then he asked me to come in and join his staff in working through human services and child welfare issues in particular. And it was at the end of that year that he asked me to serve as the state child advocate, and I left his staff, and I did that.
So you were actually on the governor's staff for a while?
I was for about a year.
Working for Jamie or with Jamie?
Jim Davey. Jim Davey was
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I did that for a year, and then I moved over to
specifically as the liaison to human services and children's issues. I see.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now back to Corzine.
They tried to get me to do other stuff, but I really wasn't interested in anything else. It's like, okay. I remember one conversation they invited me to talk with them about a bear problem in New Jersey, and I was like, I have no interest in this, which honestly isn't the thing to say to the governor, but I didn't know anything about it, and I had no interest in it, and the problems in human services were burgeoning, so they're like, okay, fine, go deal with them.
There must have been an environmental policy analyst or somebody who would have dealt with that.
There was a colleague of mine who was doing a lot of the human services work, Lisa Eisenbud. She ended up picking up a portfolio that involved that and other things too.
I'm curious about why anybody would think that a bear problem would fall under human services, but well,
I'm not sure that there was much thinking going on. It was a bit of triaging, I think, going on, because there are a lot of things coming at the governor fast and furious.
So now Corzine. Did you sit down with Corzine and talk to him during the transition?
Yeah.
Was there interest expressed by the incoming Corzine administration, and were you involved with talking to them about how to fix the problem?
Yes, I approached the governor's transition team because I was dissatisfied at my ability to move the ball down the field in child welfare reform. I frankly felt like I was, getting lots of attention. The Office of the Child Advocate was making headlines, and it wasn't making things better for kids. And it could have been vanity or ambition, or also a desire to really make government work for kids. It could have been all those things. But in reflection, I wasn't satisfied that the Office of the Child Advocate was making the kind of difference in the world for kids that I wanted to make. And I had grown, frankly, reluctantly, to come to the view that the only way to really make this system better was to jump into the system and try to lead it to a better place. So I approached the governor's transition team and expressed an interest in being a candidate to be the Commissioner of Human Services. And I had a pretty set view of what I thought it was going to take, at least in the early going. I thought it was going to take a very focused effort and a new entity, one focused entity, the Department of Children and Families. It at the time was a division in a $13 billion, Leviathan, the Department of Human Services that had all the public developmental centers and the Medicaid budget and the public welfare system and food stamps, and it just didn't have enough oxygen.
Imagine what it was like 10 or 15 years earlier when it was the Department of Institutions and Agencies that also included corrections and everything else.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
And totally unmanageable.
Yeah. They're really difficult to achieve change there.
So who were you dealing with or negotiating with on the McGreevy transition team?
You mean Corzine transition team?
I'm sorry, yeah.
I told Maggie Moran that I was interested in the position, and she said, we'll get back to you. And then I got a phone call inviting me for the first of 4 conversations with Governor-elect Corzine. And I wouldn't characterize my position at the time as negotiating. I was sharing my view of what I thought reform would take. I thought it was going to require a very significant infusion of resources. And I had paid attention to what had changed and improved the child welfare system in New York City. And it was a very strong and effective partnership between Mayor Giuliani and his ACS commissioner, Nick Scapata, who had come out of retirement in order to do that. So I want to make sure that the governor was all in. So it was conversations around that. And I think he was trying to size up whether this, kid who had a little more hair back then and was a little thinner, but had never managed anything bigger than a staff of 30, was ready to take on managing a staff of, remember, there wasn't Children and Families then, so it was just Human Services. So a staff of 22,000, a $13 billion budget, whether I could be a catalyst for change, whether I knew enough about management and operations. Frankly, I think the governor was rightly skeptical. And I think that's why there were 4 conversations, because he was still trying to test out whether I would be thoughtful enough about, Jim Collins' page 3 of Good to Great, getting the right people in the right chairs to lead the organization forward.
And you were primarily interested in children and families, right? I mean,
Yes.
There's a whole other area
Right.
of human services that would not have been an area where you would have had particular expertise.
That's exactly right. Huge areas, including the Department of Developmental Disabilities, where there was a Justice Department lawsuit pending, another system reform effort that was underway.
Okay. So what happened?
So after 4 conversations, and in the 4th, the governor came as close to saying, you can talk a good game, but can you walk it? Really challenging me about whether I was ready to surrender the halo that you get when you're a watchdog or an ombudsman, and whether you were ready to really get in it and risk reputation and brand to try to do something noble and different and better, fraught with risk. Do you really mean this? That kind of a conversation. And he offered me the position, and I walked out of the transition office. This is a mortifying story, but it's true. I walked out of the transition office. It was snowing on State Street in Trenton, and I threw up. I threw up.
Like Bill Russell before every Celtics game.
I was like, wow, this is going to be frightening. But there's no going back, because I tried direct advocacy, and I knew the limits of that direct services work. I had then tried the watchdog role, and I saw the upsides, but I also saw the limits of that work, and I was confident that the only way to achieve the kind of change that I wanted to be part of was to do this. That was terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you're now coming in with the new Corzine administration as the Commissioner of Human Services.
Yeah.
At what point did this become children and families, and did the emphasis shift with the change of name?
Well, the governor had committed to me that he would advocate for the creation of a new Department of Children and Families, and he committed to me that he would advocate for the resources that were necessary to move the reform forward, but he assured me that I would have to make the case for it. You know, it wasn't like I was going to send him an invoice and he was going to say, okay, Kev, I got this. So I knew there was going to be a lot of back and forth, and that's exactly what those first 6 months were. There were 13 legislative hearings that involved, a combination of confirmation, obviously, but beyond that, the budgets for the two departments, hearings just about the creation of the new Department of Children and Families, and special hearings about the amplified appropriation. And John was true to his word, and it was very difficult. A lot of people think, and I think this is probably true, that the reason the government shut down was because of the disconnect between the legislature and John on a variety of issues, but it was in part the appropriation for children and families. We were charged with lowering those caseloads from 70 to 80 children per worker, the sort of thing that everybody in front of the cameras says that they're in favor of, but then when you're trying to think about how to create a budget that's fair for everyone in New Jersey, those politically disenfranchised interests don't resonate. And John called me at like 2 or 3 in the morning and said, do we really need the money this year? I was like, we really do. We can't hire the workers we need to reduce caseloads, to do this work responsibly and safely, which was a piece of the reform, without those resources. And government state shut down the next day.
Right.
This isn't saying that the people in the legislature who hadn't yet reached an agreement with him were saying to him, we refuse to allocate those resources to DIFAS. I'm sure it was a mix of interests at the time, but that was one of the things that was hot between them. And because John kept faith on that promise to create a focused entity, the Department of Children and Families, so 7,000 employees came over with me, and we focused on creating a system that was designed to protect the welfare of children who were at risk in New Jersey, and frankly for the kids who'd been waiting a long time, were already in the system and had been waiting, some of them for 15 years for families, that we would get focused on guardianship and adoption and permanency for those kids. Everything became possible because of his leadership, everything. And he was tough on me. I don't mean to say that he was in any way easy. There were regular conversations around a dashboard of metrics that we created to show where we were. In the early going, he came with me very frequently to DIFAS offices or to courts to see adoption days or to see kids get reunified with their families. I can remember we were touring through a DIFAS office, and there was no computer system at the time, and they were keeping track of kids on Post-it notes in their cubicles. And I said to the governor, can you believe, this is my child advocate, I was like, can you believe we're tracking kids with Post-it notes? And he goes, aren't you in charge now? It's like, oh my God, I am. He was just intolerant of whining or that kind of, cheap seat mezzanine rock throwing. He's like, if you see the problem, fix the problem. And there were so many problems. That first month, I go out to the Toms River DIFAS office, and I'm meeting with the staff. I'm like, hey, the new commissioner's here. Now, mind you, I'd been the child advocate, so I'd been criticizing them publicly for years. So they're not feeling especially warm about me coming, but they're also overwhelmed by the work. I go in there, I can't remember there being more than 3 or 4 people in the office who are over 40. They're young. Half of them are crying, and they're describing caseloads that are completely unsustainable, with tenures of a month, 3 months on the job, 4 months on the job, with 90 kids they're in charge of, 70 kids they're in charge. I remember the person who everyone thought was making the best progress had 40 cases. And I just realized this was so broken. And that's why kids end up mummified in basements, because it's not the worker doesn't care, but Fahim is one of 80 kids that the worker's got to go out and check on, and it's not physically possible to do the job with those conditions.
So I'm a little confused about the timeline here. Where the first 6 months of the Corzine administration, you are the Commissioner of Human Services.
Yes.
You are trying simultaneously to get the appropriation for human services, but also to create a new Department of Children and Families, which essentially means spinning DYFS off of human services.
DYFS and a few other child serving agencies, the mental health department for kids, which is called the Children's Behavioral Health Division, a division on prevention.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so those components that deal specifically with children and families, you need a separate bill to create the department.
Yes.
Because the Constitution says there can't be any more than 20 departments of state government. Did you have to abolish one in order to create this one? Or was there an opening for a department at that point?
I don't remember that. That's a good question. I think I would have remembered if we had that problem.
My recollection is earlier in history. I mean, certainly during the Byrne administration, the Kane administration, whenever they created a new department, they had to either consolidate another one into an existing one, because there couldn't be more than 20 principal departments in the state government. But I don't recall whether that was the case here. Anyway, you had to create the department. You had to get a suitable appropriation for the new department, as well as a suitable appropriation for the department that you were heading.
Right.
But was all of this with the expectation that if all of this happened, that after the shutdown and things begin to start again, that you would move over to become the Commissioner of Children and Family Services and Families, and somebody else would come in to be Commissioner of Human Services?
And that was Jennifer Velez, who I mentioned earlier, who I first met. Yeah.
Did you think of yourself while you were Commissioner of Human Services and working on all this, that you were essentially a caretaker at Human Services, because this is where you really were going to go and wanted to go?
Yes, I did. I from the first day, I said to Jennifer, you have to think of yourself as the commissioner for this piece of our work. And there was another assistant commissioner.
She was assistant or deputy?
She was a deputy.
Deputy.
And there was another, maybe he was a deputy commissioner, John Dukoff at the time, and I said the same thing to him. You have to think of yourself as the commissioner for these pieces of work. I'll never be able to launch the work at DCF in such a short time, and also negotiate a resolution to the pending motion in federal court seeking receivership based on the contempt filing. I'll never be able to do that if we don't have this tripartite framework. So it was Jennifer, John, and me, and for all intents and purposes, they acted with that authority. Now, I still signed what I needed to sign. It wasn't very long. It was about 6 or 7 months, but they effectively were leading those units of government while we were making the case that DCF should, emerge.
So, at the point at which the government shutdown ends, the budget is approved. Did you feel as though, and the new department is created, did you then have to go through a whole new vetting process, or at least a nomination and confirmation process? I assume that was perhaps a bit more perfunctory than it had been when you were appointed as Human Services.
Right. That's a great question. I think I did. It's all a blur now, but I think so.
Sure. But then, okay, so the new department is set up. Same building, same people?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I mean, the mandate was to do this on the cheap. So we went to a warehouse that had furniture from former governors, I think former Rutgers presidents, and we pulled that, whatever furniture wasn't being used in the warehouse, we used that to staff the new floor. We just took a floor in the Human Services building and just kind of moved folks around. So Jennifer went up to the top floor, I was on the 3rd floor. We tried to be as economical as possible. No business cards until the former cards ran out. No signage in the first year or two. It was an effort to be as efficient as possible, because lawmakers had the right to be skeptical. They were adding lots of money, millions of dollars.
Yeah, I was going to ask, that's the other part of the equation. Did they give you the appropriation that you needed in terms of operations?
They did.
To do what needed to be done?
They did, but they invited me back, and asked tough, right questions about what was going on. And it wasn't until the first monitoring report came out and the federal monitor said, you have hit all the marks in this, first iteration. with lots more to go, that people began to think maybe this change process is headed in the right direction. And then the second report came out, and it was the same. And I knew then that we were onto something. Now, the work was just getting harder. It was hard in the beginning, but it was getting harder because the number of things that we promised to improve for children would grow over time. So in the third monitoring report, which also was a straight A report, the commitments had grown. The agency had shown real competence in lowering caseloads, in setting new state records for the number of adoptions for children who were legally waiting. What we did was we took our best recruiters in the state who had been mostly working with infants and toddlers, and we put them to work in service of the older kids who'd been waiting a long time, and said, find families for these young people. And these genius public servants who are just quiet miracles all across this state. Really, they make it the Garden State. They found families for kid after kid. 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds. We created a gallery called the Heart Gallery of the children's faces and traveled across the state. And, New Jerseyans are amazing people. They would see the faces of these kids. They would hear their stories. They'd say, that child's been in foster care for 10 years, and they'd step forward to become their guardians and their adoptive parents. And that's how we set those state records in those first 2 years for the number of adoptions, the number of foster families, and we safely reduced the number of kids in care. When a system is in chaos and you're panicked, what your staff do on the front line is they err on the side of grabbing the kid. Something bad could happen here. There could be a terrible story. I'm grabbing this kid. But when caseloads go down and you have enough resources, then people are taking time in the community to say, okay, what's going on with this family? Can grandma come in and play a role here? Can the church play a role? Can the school play a role? Can we come up with a safety plan? And when our workers had the tools and the resources to do this work safely, then we were grabbing kids left and right, and we were safely stabilizing families in their communities. And when that happened, we also then weren't stuffing kids into overcapacity foster homes where they were at greater risk for maltreatment and care. New Jersey went in the first year from having one of the country's worst records of abuse, neglect, and care to one of its best within 24 months. And really, this is about, as I just said, it's about giving workers the tools and the resources that they need to do the job. It costs a lot of money in those first couple of years.
How much money are we talking about? Can you recall off the top of your head?
Yeah, it was...
how much more than what had been
Yes,
spent
it was
previously?
$120 million more in the first year. And we were able, once we exhaled and we were able to get the system stabilized, we were able to bring children back from expensive out-of-state placements. There were hundreds of kids who were in institutions in Pennsylvania, New England, and the Midwest, and they were costing thousands of dollars a day for care that we should have and eventually did provide in New Jersey. And when those kids returned and we stopped placing children out of state, I think the net savings there was $25 million.
And was this primarily because you were able to hire more social workers to work with the kids, and therefore the numbers for each of them came down?
That was a piece of it. That was certainly a big piece of it, lowering caseloads. The second thing was lowering the ratio of supervisors to caseworkers. What was happening was New Jersey was hiring caseworkers, but they were paired with overcapacity supervisors. And people never leave jobs. They leave supervisors. And our frontline staff didn't have supervisors, or they were desperate for good supervisors. And then as a result of our lowering the ratio between supervisors and caseworkers, the caseworker attrition problem also abated, and we were able to hold on to people for a longer period of time. And a more mature worker is incredibly valuable. So that was a piece of it. Another piece of it was, I talk a little bit about this, giving workers the tools they need. This is stupid, but it actually game changed dramatically. We had a fleet of DIFUS cars, and those cars were often not in service because they were waiting in queue at the centralized repair shop for the state. So one of our appropriations was to get extra mechanics so the DIFUS cars could go back in service so workers could visit children and families and safely reconnect children with their parents, because kids can't get reunified if they never see their birth families. And most kids in the early going are going to be reunified if you can create safety or support safety for the birth family. So it was a mix of things. It was a broad mix of common sense things that you would do and often not sexy things to stabilize the organization to help keep kids safe.
You mentioned earlier Senators Vitale and Gormley as early champions of this cause. Were there others during the battle, or it doesn't sound as though it was actually a battle. It sounds as though it was more like a learning curve of creating the new department and giving it the appropriations that it needed. And this would have been in 2006.
Yes. There were three champions. Joe Vitale, peerless in terms of a very steady focus on making sure that this reform moved forward. Loretta Weinberg, who in a mix of human services causes that were very dear to her, including the treatment of developmentally disabled adults and children in the state, had DYFS reform very high in her list. And she kept the focus on that very, very steady. And in the Assembly, Bonnie Watson Coleman, who was tireless in making the case in caucus that these resources were essential and that reform for these kids was important.
When the new department was created, was there pushback either from people in DYFS? You mentioned the fact that you, as an advocate who had been criticizing them over the years, were now in charge, or from human services that felt that part of its guts were being taken out?
I can't say, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. I wouldn't necessarily have heard all that, right? What I did hear, I heard from lawmakers who were not thrilled with the way I had rolled as the child advocate. And I'm not going to vilify them because I think that I fell in love with my own voice as a child advocate. This happens to advocates, right? You just, my toughest decision was often what font size I would use in the report that would land the next day on the front page of a newspaper. And that wasn't serving the public interest as fully as I needed to. And they took me to task for that. And, I was humbled, and I needed to be humbled. I needed to be really reflective on what this was about. It wasn't the Kevin Ryan show. These are poor, often poor, kids with no inspiring circle of love around them, or a circle of love around them that's so taxed by jugulating poverty that they need a system that's going to strengthen their families and keep them safe. And there's just no room for narcissism in that mix. It just crowds out the imperative of the work. So they gave me a what for in some of those legislative hearings. And I had it coming.
John Corzine has his traffic accident in April of 2007. By this time, it sounds to me as though you had gotten reasonably close to him, that he had gone out with you on site visits.
Yes.
How did, I've asked this of all members of the cabinet and people who worked with him, how did his near-death experience and his absence for the next 6 weeks or 8 weeks or however long it was affect the operation of the department, the morale of the cabinet, your ability to do your job?
Well, personally, it was devastating. I had lost two of my closest friends in 2006, and that I'd not completely shaken that. And I don't think one ever shakes that, really, but I hadn't completely emerged from the grief of that. And so the idea that John might be gone was personally devastating. His team worked overtime to create a seamless experience for cabinet members. So there were no phone call unanswered. Folks were responsive and gave us the tools and the resources that we needed in order for there to be, an effective administration of government. I did worry. It took me maybe 3 or 4 days before this hit me, but I did worry about what was going to happen to all of this if John died, because I knew I think much more so than most folks knew at the time, I knew John was the real quarterback of this reform, that he was holding me to account. He was staying very much in conversation with lawmakers, including, and frankly, mostly lawmakers from his own party, who were itchy about whether or not these investments were right and made sense. And I worried that if John passed away or wasn't able to continue to serve, that all of this would fall apart. And because this didn't happen, with John, he sometimes describes this as, oh, you did the work. Well, that's not really true. That's not really true. I now serve for federal judges in Texas, in Oklahoma, in Mississippi, and Michigan in the context of reform lawsuits just like this one. And I see the difference that a plugged-in governor makes, and it is talismanic. And John made all that difference, and I was worried that if we lost John, we would lose the reform. And I still to this day really believe that if John hadn't been able to come back, this thing would have been right off the tracks, because it took 4 years, 2 of those years, not led by me, but led by my successors at DCF, to create the kind of forward momentum that ultimately convinced the people of New Jersey that reform was worth investing in, because look, kids were better off.
Why did you leave?
Well, it was money mostly. I have 6 children, and Danny was 16 or 17 at the time. I had 0 savings. I can still remember the vetting for the cabinet, and other more resourced cabinet members had binders of financial disclosure forms, and I had a piece of paper. And I remember one of the cabinet members saying to me, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, it's my mortgage and my car loan and my credit card debt and my student loan debt." And they laughed, and I said, "No, that's what it is. This is my financial disclosure." So I had no savings, and I'm not embarrassed I say this all the time, to say I was paying my mortgage with a credit card for the last 3 months of serving in the cabinet, because there was an ethics reform that said no outside income. And I had always managed to supplement my income by teaching at law school. And when that got cut off, and we were living then with, I don't know, I think I was bringing home net of taxes and something like $80,000 a year, with 6 kids, and the first of 6 on their way to college in 2 years, I knew this was not sustainable. I left sooner than I otherwise would have wanted to. I would have liked to have stayed another year and a half. But it wasn't in the cards, and I went on to do things that I really ended up loving doing.
Well, you left. When you left, it was reported that you were doing so to do philanthropic work in Newark and Africa, which seemed like an interesting combination, for a foundation. I believe it was the Emilio Foundation, the Ray Chambers Foundation in Newark. But the Catholic University website says that you were named Chief of Staff to the United Nations Special Envoy for Malaria.
Right.
Explain that.
Well, it was a bit of a shocker when I agreed to join Ray, which is a real thrill. Ray Chambers is one of New Jersey's great philanthropists, and is one of 3 or 4 people responsible for the major reductions in malaria deaths in the world. But it was to run Ray's foundation, which was focused at the time in Newark, with small gifts to Malaria No More and Millennium Promise that were working on development issues in Africa. And I'd announced publicly I was leaving, and then 3 days later, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, appointed Ray the Special Envoy for Malaria. And Ray said, "So we have a change in plans."
I see. So he was the okay.
You are going to be the Chief Operating Officer for the new Special Envoy Office at the UN dedicated to the eradication of malaria. I was like, okay. And, like everything with Ray Chambers, it was invigorating and terrifying, but I knew that this man was serious about even something as big as seriously reducing the number of children's deaths every year due to malaria. About 1 million kids a year at the time were dying from malaria, mostly under 5 in Africa. And Ray was close with President Bush. He was close with Gordon Brown. He really believed that by accessing more international philanthropy on a strategy of, bed nets, residual spraying, that they could in fact partner with some African countries like they did in Rwanda and others and save many, many, many kids' lives. And that's exactly what they did. I only did that work for a year. And I was helped by my brother at the time. My brother just stepped down from running one of the world's largest AIDS organizations. He'd been at Gates, then he went to AmFAR, and most recently he was the leader of the International AIDS Society, which runs the annual AIDS conference. And so my brother's a well-respected and very smart global health expert, and I leaned on him heavily in creating the infrastructure in that first year to launch the work that much later has paid off these huge dividends because of Ray and others, but Ray in the lead.
Did you do a lot of traveling in Africa as part of this?
I didn't. No. It was all focused on the United Nations infrastructure. Ray very much wanted to be in, but not of the UN. He wanted to be able to tap into its brand and its resources, but he didn't want to set up inside that bureaucracy. So we were actually, 20 blocks north, and at his own expense. Ray paid for the whole thing. I don't think there was a nickel of UN money in there. And it was about building, the coalition in the United States with other NGOs and other philanthropists to create the business plan, as Ray would say, for improving healthcare in the developing world. And it's where I met President Bush's daughter, Barbara, who was just starting an amazing charity called the Global Health Corps, and she later joined my board at Covenant House.
Oh, now, I was going to say, this is a real departure from what you had been doing and from what you would end up doing.
That's exactly right.
But it sounds as though it was a really, really interesting hiatus, if you will.
It was a logistics job. It was an ops job. Mm-hmm. So I, if I had my druthers in the world, I'd probably be doing that more than anything else because it's what I'm naturally drawn to. But though not in that substantive space. I mean, I don't consider myself, nor would anybody who's spent more than 3 seconds with me consider me a global health expert. Mm-hmm. But in terms of hiring the team, setting up the offices, building the cadences for meetings and a business plan, that was all stuff that I really loved doing.
Well, that must have been some experience that you had gained from your commissionership.
For sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I came to observe our Monday morning management meeting at DCF as a sacrament. It was religion for us. We didn't miss it, and when we did miss it, we paid the price for it. So we really became very focused and organized about where are we on these 40 things that were moving forward in the state, and each of us had a piece of it that we carried. We kept each other in the loop. We problem solved together, and it informed all the work that I have done since. Over communicating and being connected with each other on a roadmap for change.
Let's talk about the work that you've been doing since. You went back to Covenant House.
I did, yeah.
After that job?
Yeah.
Did Covenant House come to you?
They did. Covenant House was searching for a new leader, and I was obviously not a member of a Roman Catholic religious community. All the previous presidents of Covenant House had been either a nun or a priest.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, like my 5th interview, one of the board members said to me, "What will you wear?" I was like, I hope they know I'm not a priest. The organization itself
so you're the first lay person.
Yeah,
to head it. Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. And
they did a national or even international search.
They did.
I presume.
Yeah, they did a. I'm not sure international, but they certainly did a national search.
And were you approached by their search team?
I was approached by former colleagues of mine who were in senior management and said, if you're interested in this, we'd like you to throw your hat in the ring.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And you did?
I was very interested in it.
I bet you were.
I mean, this is like I think when they autopsy me, it'll be Covenant House running through my my veins. I love it.
And your title is International President.
Yeah, I'm the president and the CEO. I said to you, I've called myself the beggar in chief.
Mm-hmm. Which means you do a lot of fundraising.
A lot of fundraising, yeah.
What else? I mean, obviously you
Yeah.
run this organization now.
Yeah.
You mentioned how many thousands of people and volunteers?
We reach about
many countries?
90,000 children and youth and young families a year, 31 cities in 6 countries, and we've opened 500 new housing spaces in the last 4 years as part of our strategic plan. Just opened last week our newest Covenant House in Vancouver, month before in Mexico City, building now in Asbury Park, in Manhattan at 41st and 10th, Fort Lauderdale and Houston. And, projects burgeoning. The idea is for us to get a foothold, to be a safe place for kids to turn their lives around, and then try to build local solutions in the province or the state or the country to end youth homelessness. That sounds stargazing. It's really not. It's completely possible, but it requires a pretty deep investment.
You mentioned the 41st and 10th just jogged the memory. There's this building there right at the entrance to the Lincoln Tunnel that has said Covenant House for years. And I've seen lots of construction activity taking place in that. That's it?
That's it.
Okay. So all of our drivers, when they go into the Lincoln Tunnel, have a look. You'll see Covenant
I'm the
House.
reason the traffic is going to be really bad for the next year and a half.
No, 495 on the other side is the reason it's
Bless you.
Before we go, let's talk a little bit about, you've talked about your relationship with Governor Corzine. Tell us, if you would, how would you describe his management style? I mean, obviously in terms of your particular set of circumstances and your agency, he was very much hands-on.
Yeah.
Do you feel as though that was his general style of leadership, or do you think there was a broader array of characteristics that he brought to it?
In my experience, John's very hands-on and asks tough, smart questions and expects full answers. I think we were the better for that. There were many times where I found that frustrating because he'd thought through our third Q&A and I had only thought through our second Q&A, and so I had more work to do as a result of that back and forth. But he's very hands-on. He's got a big heart. I don't mean for that to sound sentimental. I mean, at the end of the day, he doesn't think of this, at least not in the work that I was doing, as just numbers and cents, but he wanted to know, well, how many kids have been safely reunified with their families? How many kids have been adopted? And he never missed an adoption day. We'd hop in the car and, no press. And I usually brought 2 of my Ryan kids with me, and we'd spend the day going from court to court to court, and John would see families that were adopted. And then he said to me, well, what about all the kids who are going home safely with their families, where they're reconnected? And so we started to bring him to what we called Home for the Holidays, when children were being reunified with their moms and dads or their grandparents. And he got to celebrate that too. He was low-key about all this. And then it was his idea I think it was our second holiday, to invite every DIFAS office manager to a holiday party that he hosted for them at Drumthwacket. And most of these people had never been to, they didn't know what Drumthwacket was. They had no idea. And he spent hours, table after table, thanking them, coming to understand the challenges of the work. Was it getting better? Was it not? Why did they stay? What did they love about the work? What was hard? Was I doing a good job or not? And I still, because I know many of these folks, I'll go to their homes or their offices. I see the pictures of that day still hanging with great pride and gratitude. In this way, John makes it personal. He wants to get to express his gratitude and his connection in a real way. The rap on him sometimes is that he's not a great communicator, and he can be a little standoffish. And that may have been true for sure with lawmakers. I can't say, although I've heard that. But that wasn't true in my work. He was quite the opposite. Deeply engaging, fascinated by the work, and willing to spend a lot of time in it.
Why did he lose re-election?
Well, by then I was at Covenant House, and we were, it was the recession, so we were losing donors hand over fist. I wasn't that plugged into what was happening with John, but I do think that a piece of, because obviously John now is one of my closest friends, so I don't want to mislead you and say we've never talked about this. I do think a piece of this was that Governor Christie was very effective in Ocean County and some of John's Democratic friends in Camden and Essex were under-energized, and the economy was tanking, and that was a trifecta. And I think it's a real lesson for Democrats who want to run for election or re-election about the party system, about the power of county leaders. I think it is hard to win when Democrats and Democratic leaders in the North and the South sit on their hands, and a couple of those guys and their machines sat on their hands.
It's a fairly succinct description of exactly what happened and what may happen again. One final question that I just thought of that I meant to ask you before. Were you able to replace those yellow Post-it notes with actual computer programs?
Yeah.
Okay.
That also was a very big investment. People of New Jersey are stressed and pressed by taxes. I get that. Those investments have fundamentally created safety and well-being for hundreds of thousands of children in this state. And I know that when people think about their own kids and trying to create futures for their own kids that are filled with opportunity, it can be hard to be reflective about government using their resources well. But in this way, government has used resources so well. And the Federal Monitor last week released her report and found that New Jersey has achieved across-the-board compliance in all but 2 areas. I think there are now 40 some odd areas of compliance. This is very close to exiting. And whenever I travel across the country, people say, tell me the New Jersey story. How did this go from Fahim Williams' tragedy to a model child welfare system? And it started with a governor who had a vision for government working better for politically disenfranchised young people. And that vision has largely manifest across this state with safety and well-being for so many New Jersey kids. It's why the proudest thing I've ever done is to be a part of this work with John, and I'm grateful to him for his leadership.
Can't think of a more appropriate way to end this conversation about the administration of Governor Corzine. Thank you very much, Kevin Ryan, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.